word so that we have the ability to study it and as a result come to know you and your son more. In we pray. Amen. All right, so last week we talked about 2 John, and we didn't necessarily go through verse by verse, but we were talking about kind of four topics that I think are really stand out, at least to me anyway, in 2 John. We see the idea of truth and love and how those two things go hand in hand, and you really can't separate the two, especially in the first section there of 2 John. See him mention both of those words several times. Encourages them to be watchful, especially because of these false teachers that we've been talking about so much through this. And he ties that idea to hospitality, and he doesn't encourage them to be hospitable as we might expect, but he instead warns them about being hospitable to these false teachers and tells them to refuse them. And we're going to connect that idea to 3 John here in just a moment. And so I think that's about where we left off. The instruction to not be hospitable to certain people is not something we should take to mean we need to just not be hospitable at all because we might be accepting people who are going to lead us astray. I don't think that's the result, and I think we'll really see that when we come to 3 John. But this last point I wanted to draw out of here in 2 John, he says in verse 12 of 2 John, "Though I have many things to write to you, I do not want to do so with paper and ink, but I hope to come to you and speak face to face so that our joy may be made complete." So, of course, John is obviously writing with paper and ink, and done that with a few letters, Revelation. He's done a lot of writing with paper and ink. So he clearly thinks that's an important thing to do. But he says here that there's other things I want to say, but it's important for me to do that face to face. What reason might John have to say for saying that? Why would it be important for him to say some things face to face? Yeah, a letter is a one-way form of communication unless there's a reply letter, right? You don't see the immediate response answer to that letter. There's a lot of things lost through written communication, body language, tone, things like that. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. And we nowadays communicate by written word. I don't think handwritten letters are much of a thing anymore, but what do we do all the time now? Text, email. So much of our communication, I think for a lot of people, the majority of their communication is by written word. And I think we've all read a letter and thought about, well, is this supposed to be an angry letter or angry email? Is it supposed to be an angry text, or are they being sarcastic? And when you don't see someone face to face, you can't tell their tone. It's harder to tell if something's to be taken seriously or lightly. But face to face communication is just a lot better. If we think about the fact that what John's doing is giving instruction and edification and encouragement, if we think about what if you were to read a sermon, the outline of a sermon or a transcript of a sermon, how different would that be from being here and seeing it in the pulpit? Very different, right? It's very impactful in person and not so much not. And how much more meaningful is a visit than even a phone call? Phone call can make a big difference, but how much more so is a visit? Yeah, absolutely. But yes, ma'am. And there's been a lot of times where I'm sending a text and I just stop and I pick up the phone and call him. Says, you forget this. It's going to be easier for me to tell you over the phone or wait until I see you in person later this afternoon or whatever. John writes at the end of his gospel. Remember what he writes about Jesus' life? So much more I could say, right? The world cannot contain the volumes. But the idea of being face to face is an important, necessary part of being a Christian. Important part of fellowship. That's a big part of what John talks about in 1 John. He says there in verse 12, I hope to come to you, to speak to you face to face, so that your joy may be made complete. That goes all the way back to the beginning of 1 John. That's one of the things that would make their joy complete, by having fellowship. And so I think this is, if we're to apply this to ourselves, I don't even think the point here is, well, we need to attend worship services and be face to face. I think it goes even further than that, because we can all be in this classroom. I mean, right now, maybe you're connecting with me, maybe you're connecting with people through the comments they make, but we're not really connecting on a personal level right now. You're maybe learning a lot about what I think about, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, but we're not connecting on a personal level. So just attending services is not even truly getting to know each other. So I think it goes even further than that, and we've talked about that in the past, so I won't belabor that. Absolutely. And John even says this very thing at the end of 3rd John. So he makes the same point at the end of the next letter, that he wants to see Gaius, who he's writing to shortly, and speak to him in faith. Any questions or comments about 2nd John before we move on? Yes, sir. That's a great point, and I hadn't even thought about it from that perspective, but I think you're exactly right. That's got to be something that's on his mind too, that if he doesn't get to see them soon, it could be the last opportunity. All right, so let's move on to the last of our 3 letters from John here. 3rd John is even shorter than 2nd John. In the Greek, it's 185 words. But just like 2nd John, it's much more like a kind of a standard letter that we might read than 1st John. It's here again we see John identifying himself as the elder in the beginning. He does in 2nd John. And 2nd John was narrower in scope and what is talked about than 1st John, of course. And I would suggest that 3rd John is even narrower than that, as we'll see. So what I'd like to do here is, again, as we did last week, read through 3rd John. It's very short. It's a couple verses longer than 2nd John, but as I said, it's actually shorter in terms of word count. But as I read through, think again, what are some similarities with 1st and 2nd John? Are there any differences from those two? And we'll talk about that. So we'll pick up in 3rd John verse 1. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that in all respects you may prosper and be in good health, just as your soul prospers. For I was overjoyed when brothers came and testified to your truth, that is, how you are walking in truth. I have no greater joy than this, to hear of my children walking in the truth. Beloved, you are acting faithfully in whatever you accomplish for the brothers and sisters, and especially when they are strangers, and they have testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their way in a manner worthy of God. For they went out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore we ought to support such people, so that we may prove to be fellow workers with the truth. I wrote something to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first among them, does not accept what we say. For this reason, if I come, I will call attention to his deeds, which he does, unjustly accusing us with malicious words. And not satisfied with this, he himself does not receive the brothers either, and he forbids those who want to do so and puts them out of the church. Beloved, I do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. The one who does what is good is of God. The one who does what is evil has not seen God. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself, and we testify too, and you know that our testimony is true. I had many things to write to you, but I do not want to write to you with pen and ink. And I hope to see you shortly, and we will speak face to face. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends by name. All right. So what did you pick up on? Are there any similarities between 3rd John and 1st or 2nd John? What did you notice that was similar? Walking in the truth. Okay, so I think that exact phrase is used in 2nd John when he's talking about this chosen lady. He's glad to hear that Gaius is walking in truth. Same said there. What else? Face to face, right? That same thing he says. I hope to see you and speak to you face to face. Yep. What else? Okay. Yep. What else? Okay. What does it say about Gaius and how John feels about him? Similar to that, he's walking in truth. It says that John loves Gaius in truth. Okay, so that same phrase there again. Talk about how that's in there in 2nd John. We can't separate love and truth. There's, as we'll talk about in a minute, there's kind of an issue of hospitality that's addressed in both of these. There's statements about who is of God and who is not. That's a comparison that we see in the other letters as well. So what is there anything that's missing that you don't see here that we saw a lot of in the other letters? There is, somebody mentioned the sake of the name, so maybe that's a reference to Jesus, but we don't really see this discussion of Jesus and those denying Jesus. That's a big topic and theme in the other two. We don't really see that here. So a little bit of difference there. Obviously, this is much shorter. John's not setting out a fleshed out argument like he is in 1st John. But if we think about how we could outline this, again, like 2nd John, it's fairly easy to outline compared to 1st John. So the first 8 verses, John is really praising Gaius. He seems to be a righteous man doing a lot of good things. And so praising him, encouraging him. The next couple of verses, we see this person Diotrephes introduced. He's rebuked by John. And then there's a call to goodness or righteousness. Again, we see that coming up again. And then a conclusion, we have a similar kind of send-off as 2nd John had. So one easy way to remember what's different about 3rd John from the others is that there's 3 people in 3rd John. 3 different people that we see here. Of course, it's written to Gaius. We see that at the very beginning. What do we learn about Gaius from what we just read? Yeah, John has a love for him. He seems like probably a pretty nice guy to be around. Okay. Anything else? What do we pick up on about Gaius from here? Yeah, he's walking in the truth. So he's apparently a good person. He's living as he's calling on Christians to do. There is a mention of someone named Gaius in a few different places in the New Testament. We see one mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Romans 16, Acts 19. I think there's probably a good chance that this is a different Gaius. This is actually one of the most common names in the Roman Empire back then. As we talked about, this is towards the end of the 1st century, so I think more than likely this is not the same Gaius that we read about in those other places. Those are in different parts of Europe and Asia. So I think the most we could pick on and think about Gaius is probably from our text here. But we see he's loved by John. He's a good person. John refers to him as beloved 3 different times. And you really can just see hopefully you see by now why John is referred to as the apostle of love. He writes so much about love. You see the love he has for his audience in all of his letters. There's a reason why he's called by that name. So then we have, of course, Diotrephes. What do we pick up on about Diotrephes just from what we read? Sure. Yeah, he wants them to have a good life, to have a good spiritual well-being. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a little more in just a second. But yeah, it's a very encouraging thought there that John says. Yes, ma'am. John. Yeah. Yep. Right. So Diotrephes, what do we see here if we compare him with Gaius? What do we see about Diotrephes? Yeah, he cares about himself foremost. We see Gaius is hospitable, and Diotrephes is the exact opposite. He's not hospitable, and he's trying to prevent others from being hospitable. Other than that, I don't think we really know a lot about who this person is. We don't really read about another Diotrephes in Scripture. So this is about all we know. And then there's a third person that's almost kind of just thrown in there, Demetrius. It seems like maybe he's just a good person who's doing good things that John wanted to shout out. So we don't know much about him either. But there's the three people that we see here in the letter. And so then, like we did last week, I don't necessarily want to go through all this verse by verse, but I will just want to kind of point out a few topics or points that really kind of stand out to me as I study through this. So first is, as was just mentioned, this prayer that John has for Gaius there in verse 2. He says, "Beloved, I pray that in all respects you may prosper and be good in good health, just as your soul prospers." Clearly, he's praying about not just spiritual well-being, but physical well-being in all respects. So his livelihood, whatever they may have been, success in that, success in life and in spiritual things. And interestingly enough, if you've heard of the prosperity gospel, a lot of us have heard of that. This is actually a verse that people will look at and point to suggest that God is promising us that if we're faithful, then we'll prosper in this life. I don't really think that's the point that John's trying to make at all. We can look at a lot of other places where I would say that we're by no means guaranteed financial well-being, good health as a result of being a Christian. In fact, there's a lot of scripture we can look to that says you may be persecuted, you may die, bad things may come as a result of being a Christian. It's very clear that our reward is where? Heaven, eternity, not in this life. And I would think if we were guaranteed, financial success, prosperity in all respects, as is mentioned here, I don't know that John would necessarily need to pray for it, right? He would just need to pray for a good spiritual well-being, and then the rest would follow if that were the case. But so I think we need to be wary of that idea, and it's become very commonplace, this prosperity gospel. I'm not going to belabor that too much, but I did read an interesting quote that said that the prosperity gospel movement offers people the same thing that the devil offers, just do so in the name of Christ. If you think about what does the devil want us to look at? Things. Focus on things of this world rather than spiritual things. But having said that, John does pray for spiritual well-being and physical well-being. So I think that's a precedent for us. It's okay for us to pray for us to have a good life. It's okay for us to seek a good life, to want to have good health and success in our jobs or whatever it may be. That's certainly something that's okay for us to do. But my question is do you find that you pray for good health, or you pray for people's health more so than their spiritual health? What do you think? What do we typically do? I think we do. I think a lot of us do. I just know I find myself praying for so and so to get healthy, so and so surgery to go well, a lot more than I pray about specific people who I know have a spiritual need. That's just at least what I've caught myself doing. I don't know about you, but I think we need to be just as much, if not a lot more so, concerned about people's spiritual well-being, because our reward is in eternity. And if our reward's in eternity, we should be a lot more concerned about the person who we know is lost than the person who's going through surgery. Doesn't mean we can't pray for both, and John certainly prays for both sides of life here. But we need to be concerned about our spiritual well-being just as much, if not more so, as our physical well-being. Any thoughts or comments about that? Good point. I mean, from what we read here, Gaius is a good person. He's commending him for doing right things. He's praying that he'll keep doing that, I think. And I think you're right. I mean, we do tend to pray when things go bad. That's just our normal practice, is to pray when things go bad, whether it's physically, spiritually, and not so much things are good. That's a good point. Yes, sir. Good point. And we don't have control over some things when it comes to health and things like that, but we do have control over our faith. So good point. I appreciate that. All right, so let's look at our next point here: hospitality and support of evangelists. So we talked about with Second John, one of the things, the problem with all these false teachers, there were some that were even going and traveling to share their false teaching. And so John warned them in Second John not to receive them, and even says that if you receive them, you're kind of aiding and abetting them. So that's a good point. Yeah, if we're going to pray and ask God for these things, we need to also thank Him for when He does bless us with those. That's a good point. Yep. No, that's a good point. I appreciate you saying that. All right. So John warns them about being hospitable and opening their homes up to people who are these false teachers, who are going to lead people astray. And we talked about the context of that. Where was the church meeting at this time? In homes, right? So there's a whole nother level to that, to this idea of hospitality and receiving people in your home that we don't necessarily think about. And so the question then is, well, if people are going to be, coming in, and we have to worry about them. Should we just be shut off from anyone who's not a Christian and we know is teaching the truth? Well, I think the answer is no. We see here one of the things Gaius is commended for. He says in verse 5, "You're acting faithfully in whatever you accomplish for the brothers and sisters, and especially when they are strangers." He's commended for, in verse 8, there's a reference to supporting people. So I think what I gather from that is that there's evangelists who are traveling. Gaius is helping support, receiving them. Gaius is doing a good job of that. So the answer to should we just not be hospitable just out of caution, the answer is no. He's showing love to the brethren. That's what has John been talking about over and over in letters, love for the brethren. And Gaius is really putting that into practice and doing a good job of that. If we come to Diotrephes, though, what is he doing? Yeah, the opposite. He is not being hospitable. It says in verse 10, he himself does not receive the brothers either. He even forbids those who want to do so. So we don't know exactly what was happening, but clearly there's one brother who's being hospitable, one who is not, and encouraging others to not be hospitable. So that's clearly not what John wants and what we should be doing. I want to pick up on verse 8 here. "Therefore we ought to support such people so that we may prove to be fellow workers with the truth." Do we ever think that if you don't teach or you don't preach, you're not contributing a whole lot to sharing and spreading the gospel? You ever thought that? I don't think it's true, but I think we've probably thought that. It's the ones who are really sharing the gospel are those who are out teaching and preaching. That's what I think people tend to think, and that as long as that's happening, I don't have to worry about my role in it. But what is John saying here? How can everyone participate in evangelism or sharing the gospel? By supporting those who do, exactly. So what are some ways that we might support our preaching? Okay. Encouragement. Or even face-to-face encouragement too. But yeah, encouragement, absolutely. Prayers. Point. What else? Financial support. Okay, absolutely. Right. Yeah, so that's a lot of your contribution, as we've broken down in recent weeks, goes to supporting people here within our congregation, preaching and teaching, but also abroad. Lots of people all over the world that we support in their efforts to evangelize and share the gospel. So there are ways to contribute and help share the gospel by being hospitable. Pretty soon we're going to have our summer series. Every year we do a list where you can feed the preacher. That's a perfect way to be hospitable to a traveling evangelist. A good example there. But as Christians, one of the ways we put this into practice, this love for the brethren, is by being hospitable, whether it's people we know or strangers. And we see Gaius doing that here, and he is commended by John for doing that. Any thoughts here about that idea there? All right. Let's move into our last point here. Imitate what is good, not what is evil. Verse 11. "Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. The one who does what is good is of God. The one who does what is evil has not seen God." We talked over and over again in 1 John. John telling Christians to do what's right, be righteous because God is righteous. What was the standard we had for righteousness in 1 John? Yeah, God's truth. Jesus. Yep, right. And so even if we don't necessarily have Jesus mentioned by name per se, I think if we think about, what is it to imitate? What does it mean to imitate? to be like. So if you're going to imitate something, here imitate what's good. Well, how do we know what's good? We need something to follow, something to imitate, something to be like. And I think our example there is Jesus. I mean, that's we want to imitate God. Well, what did God look like and do when he came to earth and lived as a man? So clearly Jesus. If you go all the way back to the very beginning, when mankind is created, how was mankind created? What was mankind patterned after? Made in God's image. That's what God says. Let's make man in our image. So that was the intent when we were created, so that we would be like God. And unfortunately, we tend to imitate what's evil a lot of times rather than imitating what is good. Christ-like, exactly. That's what that's intended to mean. Imitate Christ. Yep. Yeah. So I mean, we don't really shouldn't have a question of what we need to be doing, and clearly have a pattern set out for us. So the question, and I think if we think about who do we imitate, we tend to imitate people we're around, people we spend time with. Have you ever do you ever have a friend or someone, coworker who says some particular phrase or has a certain way of saying something all the time? Have you ever caught yourself saying that the same way? What does that tell you? When you're around someone and you listen to someone talk, you end up talking like they do a lot of times. But we tend to imitate what we focus on, who we spend time around, who we see. So who are you imitating? What is your pattern? Last week I got to take some teens to the teen weekend. It's kind of like a mini one-day camp up at Glen Springs that they've been putting on. And I wasn't there for all of the teaching, but one thing I did hear was Phil Robertson talking about how he thinks it's really important for him and for teens to have a board of directors. And what he means by that is you need in your life a board of directors of people who are like spiritual advisors and who you can look up to and imitate. So not only I think that we need to imitate God and imitate Christ, but we need to have people in our lives who are good examples and patterns for how we should live. And if we're going to pick up some sayings and some ways of talking, it better be from people who are trying to do the same thing and imitating what is good. But of course, we see a call back here to what John says frequently. How do we identify a Christian? Who is it that knows God? Who is of God? The one who does what is good. Any thoughts about any of that before we move on here? And I know I like to think that I influence people more than they influence me, but I think if we're honest with ourselves, we can't help but be influenced by those around us and what we consume and what we're taking in on a regular basis. But yeah, so we need to be selective about our people that are in that school. Any other thoughts about anything with 3rd John? Yeah, I mean, it really does connect to what we said in 1 John. Do not love the world. We can't take ourselves out of the world, right? But we need to abstain from the things that are in the world. All right. Anything else on 3rd John? And we're going to introduce a little bit of. All right. Let's move on to Jude. So Jude is another one of our short, one-chapter letters in the New Testament. Philemon's the other one. But Jude is one chapter. It's a good bit longer than 2nd and 3rd John, and there's, I think, a lot more to unpack. There's some, I don't know if challenging things are the right word, but it's some interesting things to think about and talk about. So Jude talk about the authorship. Jude, actually, if we were to translate that more literally, it would actually be Judas or Judah. It's not that Judas, not Judas who betrayed Christ, but we see that it's translated as Jude. The original Greek Aramaic would be Judah or Judas. I think there's a reason why we kind of think of it as Jude more so than Judas, because, I mean, have you ever met anyone named Judas? Judas was a very common name back then, so it would have been, if you're a Christian, being named this might have been a little awkward, I think. But you don't meet anybody named today Judas, for obviously for good reason. But Jude here identifies himself as a bondservant of Jesus Christ and the brother of James. So if we think about James, I don't think it's the brother of John. What do we know about James, the brother of John, and what happened to him? Yeah, he was killed very early on. Acts 12, I think, is where we read about that. He was one of the first, or one of the earliest martyrs. So I think we can rule him out. The only other James who's well known in the first century is James, the brother of Jesus. Okay, if you look at Matthew 13:55. Quickly. Matthew 13:55. Is this not the carpenter's son? Is his mother not called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Okay. We see a list of Jesus' brothers there, and James and Judas, or Jude, are two of them there. If we look in Acts, we see that James, the brother of Jesus, takes on a leadership role in the church in Jerusalem. Acts 15, he's one of the ones who participates in this council in Jerusalem. We could read about him in other places. And so if Jude is the brother of James, what does that mean? Jude is also the brother of Jesus, right? So this appears to be Jude, one of Jesus' brothers. Now you may be thinking, well, wait, didn't Jude and James, didn't Jesus' brothers reject him? Didn't his family kind of reject him at one point? And that seems to be the implication from there in Matthew 13. They're puzzled by him. But if we look at Acts chapter 1 and we look at the list of people who are there in the beginning of Acts, we see James and Jude listed among those with the apostles and Mary, the mother of Jesus. So what would have changed from Matthew 13 to Acts 1? What really big change happens? Jesus crucified, and then what? Resurrected. So I think that's the big change there. I mean, it's certainly a big change for the apostles. They struggle with their understanding, and then they're totally different people when the resurrection takes place. It's interesting to me then that if this is the brother of Jesus, we see him refer to himself not as the brother of Jesus, but the brother of James. What does he identify as his relationship with Jesus, though? Yes, but right there in Jude 1, bondservant. Doesn't say Jude, the brother of Jesus, and the brother of James. He says, no, Jude, a bondservant of Jesus. Remember what Jesus said about his brothers and mothers when he's asked, they're looking for you. Remember what he says? Jesus is pointing out that, it's not our earthly relationships that ultimately matter. It's a spiritual relationship. Jude, I think, is recognizing his physical relationship with Jesus is not really what matters. It's the spiritual relationship, and he has the right perspective about who Jesus is to him. He is his master, not just his brother, but his master. So he's putting that right out at the front. And people would have known in the first century reading this. They would have known who Jude was. They would have known he was a brother of James, a brother of Jesus. And so I think, to me at least, it's intentional that he says that right at the beginning. I'm not the brother of Jesus. I am his bondservant. Okay. So when we think about the audience here, I think it's written primarily to Jewish Christians, Christians who had a Jewish background. As we read through Jude, we're going to see that there are a lot of references to the Old Testament, and they're not described in detail about what's being talked about. There'll be references to names and events without details. So Jude is, I think, assuming a basic understanding of the Old Testament. So I think he's probably writing largely to Jewish Christians. And we know a lot of the first century Christians did come from a Jewish background, of course. Similar to John's audience, we know that John was writing to Christians who are dealing with false teaching. We're going to see that Jude's audience is dealing with false teaching, and that's his primary purpose for writing this letter, as we're going to see next week. We also see that Jude also has a love for his audience. He refers to his audience as beloved, as John does several times in his letters. And so the purpose, as we wrap up here, we see in verse 3 and verse 4 of Jude. Beloved, while I was making every effort to write you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, appealing that you contend earnestly for the faith that was once for all time handed down to the saints. For certain people have crept in unnoticed, those who were long beforehand marked out for this condemnation, ungodly persons who turn the grace of our God into indecent behavior and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. So it seems that Jude was going to write a different letter about our salvation, but he needed to write this letter instead that encourages them and warns them about false teachers and encourages them to contend earnestly for the faith. So we'll pick up there next week. Yep. They at the very least were skeptical of who he was. Right. All right, so we'll pick up there and get into Jude next week. Appreciate your comments and attention.